budding herbalists. I'm Maria Noel Groves, author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies, out here at Wintergreen Botanicals in Allenstown, New Hampshire on this beautiful wintry day. And today I'm going to show you how to play around with chocolate and herbs. And chocolate and herbs can come together in so many different ways, but what we're going to focus on in this video is how to make chocolate truffles. And this is one of our slightly more labor intense, time intense chocolate recipes, where there are a lot of other chocolate recipes that are in your notes that are much faster and quicker to put together. And so for this recipe, we're going to be doing a sort of classic remedy in cooking where we make an infusion of our herbs in one of our liquid ingredients with a little bit of heat. And in this case, we're going to be infusing peppermint, our herb of the day, with our cream, and then later on we're going to strain that out, and then we're going to use that cream to make the ganache middle. And there are a lot of different ways that you can incorporate herbs into chocolate. You can put the powders right in, you can use extracts and add those, you can add hydrosols, but this is one of our typical ways of working with it, especially for making truffles. And this particular truffle recipe is inspired by a couple different truffle recipes that I've seen out there by foodie herbal experts Susan Belsinger and Jerry Tronfeld, and they both have some really lovely cookbooks out there focused on herbs, and this combines two of their recipes together. But really the concepts are pretty simple. It's just a little bit labor intense. Often I do this in a classroom setting, or it's a really great one to enlist your kids or your family members or friends to join you in on, because especially as we get to the last few steps, it helps to have a couple extra sets of hands. Otherwise it can be pretty tedious. And today I'm going to be making this recipe in a quarter batch size because it's the middle of a pandemic as I'm recording this, and I'm not going to be seeing too many people to share chocolates, and I really don't need like 30 plus chocolates just for myself and my husband. So we're gonna do a smaller batch today. Today we're going to be working with coconut cream as our cream for the middle of the ganache. Classically we would use a full-on, full-fat heavy cream, and that comes out really beautifully. However, in trying to make this recipe a little bit more friendly for some of my dairy-free friends, of whom I have a lot of dairy-free friends, I started playing around with coconut cream, and that comes out quite nicely too, especially if you do want to make a vegan or dairy-free chocolate truffle. I really like this one. It's just the really thick part of the coconut. So you can use whichever you have, but I happen to have this on hand today, so that's what we're going to be using. And the recipe that we're making, we're cutting it down by a quarter. So normally you'd be using a full cup of your heavy cream or your coconut cream or whatever cream ingredient you're using. You want something that's really, really thick, like heavy cream or coconut cream would be. And because we're going to do a quarter batch, I'm actually going to use 1/4 cup instead. Or I could weigh that out, and that's what I'm going to do here just to make it a little bit easier with fewer dirty dishes. A 1/4 cup is approximately 2 ounces by weight, and so we're going to measure it that way because I don't need this whole container for this particular small batch recipe. Before we get into that, let's start off by just preparing our chocolate. And so I'm going to do that in my scale here. It's much easier to measure a lot of these things by weight. And if you buy your chocolate, you can also just look at the weight on the chocolate and eyeball approximately. If like this bar is just under 3 ounces, and so I could kind of adjust that way. But since I have a scale, I'm going to use a scale so that I can get a little bit more exact. So we're just going to prep the chocolate so that it's set aside and ready and waiting for later. And let me zero out my scale here. To make a typical batch, we're going to want 14 ounces of finely chopped chocolate chips, or good quality chocolate chips, or you could use bar chocolate like I'm using today and just kind of break it up into smaller pieces. And the more finely chopped, the better. I'm going to be a little bit lazy today and pull out the double boiler if needed to melt it down a little bit further. And since we're going to be doing a quarter batch, we're going to actually do 3.5 ounces instead, which is a little bit more than 1 bar. I've got my scale zeroed out here. I'm going to break this up right in the wrapper. And I am using fair trade chocolate here. That's not absolutely necessary. Some chocolatiers will say that the fair trade chocolate doesn't really taste as good as some of the non-fair trade and organic chocolate, but chocolate is a pretty sinister industry. There's a lot of forced labor, child labor, and some people will call it blood chocolate, kind of like we call diamonds blood diamonds. And so if you want to not support that, then seeking out fair trade chocolate and organic too if you want to help support the environment. So I'm just gonna throw this in here. You can use milk chocolate, dark chocolate. I'm going to be using milk chocolate for the middles today just because I feel like it, and then I'm going to use dark chocolate on the outside. So that's 3 ounces right there according to my scale, and I just need about a half an ounce more, so I just need a little bit more from this next bar. I'll just have to find something to do with the leftover chocolate. Close. A little bit too much. Probably doesn't matter that much how exactly perfect you get it, but we're right at 3.5 right now, so that's perfect. So we're going to set that aside. I'll show you what that looks like. So next up, we're going to add our cream. If this was heavy cream, this would be really easy to measure. You could just pour it into a measuring cup because it's liquid. But since it's coconut cream and it's semi-solid, I'm going to actually measure this one by weight as well so that I can get a little bit more exact. And we would be using a whole cup of heavy cream or your coconut cream. But in this case, because I'm doing a quarter batch, I'm just going to be using a quarter cup or approximately 2 ounces. So let's get that out. And so coconut cream is going to be, coconut cream is going to be kind of like a combination of liquid and solid. And we're mostly after that more solid ingredient there. We're mostly more after the solid stuff. If a little bit of liquid gets in, that's okay. We can throw the rest of it in some other recipe like a smoothie. Kind of messy. There we go. We have about 2 ounces right there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to melt that down to a liquid. And you would still heat this up even if this was already a liquid because we want it to be warm. We want to make almost like a tea, except instead of using water, we're going to use this liquid cream to infuse our herbs into that. And so let's give that a chance to just melt down a little bit. All right, so this is all melted and nice and warm. If you are using heavy cream, you want to be really careful and stir frequently to make sure that it doesn't bubble up and burn, which can be a bigger problem with real dairy than it is with things like coconut cream. I actually had to have a whole building evacuated because we set off the fire alarm in a class once when the cream, I wasn't looking, and it bubbled up and burned, and it was just a big old mess. So you don't want to do that. You might not have to have the fire department come and evacuate the building, but it's still not something you really want to have happen. So this is nice and liquid here and nice and warm. And so we are going to just kind of let that be. And we're going to add a tablespoon or so of peppermint. And, you know, if you were using a more delicate flavored herb, you might use a little bit more herb. You might even use a little bit more liquid that you've heated up ahead of time because you will lose some of that in the straining process. So, you know, you can just kind of play around with these approximate measurements. So I have a big jar here, but really I just need a tablespoon or so. And that should be plenty to give us our flavor. So I just have about a tablespoon here. We're going to mix that in with our 2 ounces. And I'm going to put the lid on it and I'm going to let it sit for about 30 minutes and we'll come back after approximately 30 minutes. If it's a little longer than that, that's totally fine. But we'll come back and we'll strain that out. So we'll see you in just a moment. So we're back and our herbs have infused, our peppermint has infused into our cream and we're ready to strain it out. And so we have this really beautiful mix here. And like, if you remember, we're just making a quarter batch, so it's really not a very large amount. I'm gonna bring this up just a little bit warmer and this will save me a step later on. Also, because I'm using coconut for this particular recipe, coconut does tend to solidify a lot more easily than, say, heavy cream would. And so by warming it up, it's going to make it a little bit easier to strain and get as much liquid out as possible. And to strain this out, I'm going to use one of my favorite typical methods for straining out a lot of my herbal remedies, where I use a fine mesh metal cone strainer inside of a Pyrex pouring container. And this is kind of a medium size. I think this is probably about 4 inches or so, and that works really nicely in a wide variety of sizes. So this is actually only a 1 cup Pyrex pourer, but it should work just fine there. So you can see how it's, you know, just kind of a nice system there. And we're going to pour this out. And then I'm just going to use my spoon to really squeeze as much of the cream out of the herbs as possible. We've already prepped our chocolate ready to go for the next step. What we're going to do here is we're just going to pour our hot cream over the chocolate. And ideally, if things were broken up really finely, this might be enough to melt the chocolate. But really, we probably will have to put a little bit in the double boiler to melt it down all the way. We'll pour that in. And a typical ganache for recipes is equal parts chocolate and cream. And this is a little less cream than that, but you can easily play around and find what works for you. We want it to be not a perfectly soft, you know, we're not making frosting. We're making something that we're going to want to ultimately be able to hold together as a firm ball in the middle of our truffle. Because what we're making right now is that middle of the chocolate truffle that's a little soft and smooth, but we don't want it to melt all over the place if it gets the slightest bit warm out. So, you know, this is going to melt on our chocolate a little bit, but not entirely. And so I'm going to put this on the double boiler and just melt it down a little bit more so that we can get all that chocolate to melt down. And there are a lot of different ways to do melting of chocolate. I wouldn't generally put it directly on the burner. That's usually too hot and you run the risk of burning your chocolate and ruining your whole recipe. So one thing that I learned from watching Julia Child is she would just bring one larger pot of water up to temp, up to just about a boil, remove it from the heat, and then plunk her chocolate that was in a smaller pot right into it and let it sit not on the heat at all. And usually that will help melt things down without you running the risk of overheating with the active burner down. I am going to do the double boiler method right now, and I'm just using a metal mixing bowl on top of a pot of water. You could have a slightly bigger bowl like this that might actually sit on top a little bit more so it's not pressing down into the water. Or you can use an actual double boiler if you happen to have one on hand. So I've already brought some temperature, some water here is already just starting to simmer. So let's see how much we can get away with right there. Let's see if we can get this to melt down. Just kind of let that sit for a moment. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do end up needing to bring things back up to temp on the heat too. So we're gradually getting there. And I'm going to keep melting down. And I will admit that like a true chocolatier would be pretty horrified by the quality of my chocolate right now because it is a little separated and it's not really quite perfect. And I did buy this chocolate a few months ago expecting to use it for a video more quickly. And so it's not quite as high end because it's probably been through a few aging processes, but it'll be fine enough for my purposes today. But you know, generally when you're working with chocolate, you want it to be a little bit smoother and less separated than this. All right, I've got some more warm water here just to get that final melt in. All right, I'd say we're pretty much there. And so we'll remove that from the heat and we'll just let that sit. Chill it in a refrigerator for a little bit. We want it to become solid again and even a little bit colder than normal, like room temperature solid would be, because later on we're going to need to have it be firm enough that we can roll it into balls with our hands and dip it into hot chocolate without having it melt. So we're going to cover it up, let it sit in the fridge for a little while, a couple hours, and come back and finish up our recipe. So now we're on to our last few steps for making cordials, and this is where things get a little bit more labor intense. Up until this point, it's just do a few little things and then wait, do a few little things and then wait. But now is the time that it's nice to have a bunch of hands on deck, especially if you're going to be making a larger batch than we're making today. We've got our base here all nice and chilled, but before we go and start playing around with that, I need to melt down some more chocolate, and that's going to be the outside of our truffle. And so I'm going to melt down, I've got some extremely dark chocolate for us to work with today, and I'm going to start off with just one of these. You know, theoretically, by breaking down my recipe, I might only need about 2 ounces of dipping and rolling chocolate, but because I need to be able to get it all around the ball of truffle, I want to make sure that I've got a little extra space. So I've got an extra one here if I need it, but I'm just going to start off with the 1 bar and weigh it out, but I don't really need to weigh it out because I'm just going to use the whole bar as it is. So I'll break that up, make it a little easier for that to melt down. I can also start getting my double boiler warmed up. We have a really nice chocolatier nearby in Manchester called Dancing Lion Chocolates, and they teach proper truffle making classes that I'm sure get into a lot better detail than this sort of hodgepodge, half you know what, herbalist version. But you know, they all still come out tasting good in the end, so this is just fine for me. We're just going to melt that down in our double boiler. And it'll take a little while, but we also want to make sure that we don't burn it. All right, I think we're just about there. There's one little piece left, but we're pretty nice and melted, and we don't want to melt any more than necessary. So we're going to pour that into a container for dipping. I can just dip in this if I really wanted to, but I like getting something that's a little bit more narrow so that I can more easily dip. So let's give this a whirl. So we have our chilled chocolate ganache middle, and that's what we're going to use for the base of our chocolate. So this is what we're going to use for the base of our chocolate, and we're going to roll this up. I do like to kind of prep up the space. Normally I'd have my hair up and all that too. And of course, if you're going to be sharing these with others, you should probably be wearing gloves and make sure everything is all nice and sanitized. But for the purposes of video and making a small batch, we're just going to go with the flow. I do like using some just little mini baking cups, and this makes for a handy thing that we're going to ultimately put our truffles into. I'll just lay a few of those out for now, but you'll ultimately need a lot more, especially if you're making a big batch. And we have something to scoop with. We have some things to dip with. We have a little something to decorate with at the top. You'll see why. And I am going to use gloves to make the process a little bit less messy and also a little bit more sanitary. So we're just going to scoop a little bit out, depending upon how big you want your chocolate ball to be. So you're just going to roll that into a ball. And when we do this in class, I try to set aside the cold hand people to do the rolling, because if you have really warm hands, it's going to start to melt the chocolate. So you want to do this process as quickly as possible. And if you happen to have cold hands, that's even better. Or if you happen to have somebody around who has cold hands, maybe you can have them do this particular spot. Then I'm going to take something that I can spear it with. I'm going to spear my truffle ball and make that so that it's nice and secure there, and then I'm going to dip that in the chocolate. And I personally will then put this directly into the cup. So I'll put this. So I'll take this chocolate dipped ball and I'll put it right in the cup, and I'll just use another skewer to pop that in there. And because I'm not very good at doing this, we end up with a big old mess on the top. Look at that horrible mess. I mean, it's kind of messy. So I could drizzle a little bit of chocolate on top. And nobody will be any wiser. I could also even take some white chocolate and make decorations once things have solidified a little bit, whatever you want to do. A lot of times I will take a little bit of some sort of decorative petal, and you know, if I had fresh mint, I could use fresh mint leaves, but I don't. So I'm just going to take a couple rose petals here and just kind of place them on top to make it look pretty. I'm making it more messy. And in the world of chocolatiers, they actually have special little scoopers, I hear, for helping to transfer the balls from the dip into the dipper and then easily get them off. So I've had some students use spoons. Let's try using a spoon, see if that's any better. Kind of dip that in. We're going to lose a lot of chocolate here in the process, but it does look a lot neater. And then if I wanted to, I could still decorate it. Especially if you have different flavors, you might want to do different decorations so that you know which flavor is which. And that's how you make truffles. It's a tedious process, and they're not going to probably come out perfect unless you're one of those OCD perfect Martha Stewart type people. But you know what? People are still really excited when they get a homemade chocolate truffle. And you can use the same concept of rolling things. So you could make a herbal nut butter, like your inside of your bonbon, with honey and nut butter or seed butter and powdered herbs. Chill those in balls and then dip them in and make a little like sort of peanut butter ball kind of thing that you could have. You could play around with taking old frosting. That's not very healthy, but you can make little chocolates that way, and you can really have fun with this and make some recipes to give to others, especially to your chocolate lovers. So have fun with this and happy herbal adventures.